All right, the next piece of the puzzle is this. Sine of theta reference and sine of theta, except for the signum, the positiveness or negativeness, sine of theta reference and sine of theta are equal. If sine of theta is 1/2, then sine of theta reference is 1/2. The only possible difference would be the signum, that is to say the positiveness or negativeness. And so what that tells us is if you know the reference angle for theta and you know the quadrant that theta lies in, then you should be able to compute the sine value. And this is true not just for sine, but for all 6 trigonometric functions. Except for the signum, it is true that the cosine of an angle is equal to the cosine of the reference angle. Tangent of theta reference is equal to tangent of theta, except for the signum. The signum we're going to take care of because we know our memory device, A, S, T, C. So we should be able to put this together with our knowledge of the reference angle families and with our value of in what quadrants the functions are positive, and knowing that the sine of the reference angle and sine of the angle are equal to each other. So consider sine of 5 pi over 6. From our earlier work, the question is, do we remember the reference angle family? Well, 5 pi over 6. This is in the reference angle family for pi over 6. And do we remember that 5 pi over 6 is in quadrant 2? The reference angle family for pi over 6, think through that again. That's pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6, and 11 pi over 6. So sine of 5 pi over 6, we know this is in the pi over 6 reference angle family, and we know that this is 1, this is 1/2, this is root 3 over 2, and this is pi over 6. We know sine is the y coordinate, that's the vertical value. Sine is the y coordinate, that's the vertical value. Sine is 1/2, but we need to place this in the proper quadrant. We know that 5 pi over 6 is in quadrant 2, and so we know this needs to be positive because sine is positive in quadrant 2. So we've taken care of the signum, and we know that 5 pi over 6 falls in the reference angle family for pi over 6. Sine of 5 pi over 6 and sine of pi over 6 are the same up to the signum, which we've already taken care of. Put that all together, and sine of pi over 6 is the vertical, the y value, that would be 1/2, positive 1/2. Sine of 5 pi over 6 is 1/2. Because it's in the reference angle family for pi over 6, hence the numeric value is 1/2, and we choose the appropriate signum based upon knowing the quadrant that we're in. So let's do this the same thing again. Now let's consider sine of 11 pi over 6. Do you recognize 11 pi over 6? Yes, that's the quadrant 4 value for the reference angle family pi over 6. What is sine in quadrant 4? Well, we know sine in quadrant 4 is negative. So whatever this is going to be, it's going to be negative something. But we know the reference angle family is pi over 6. Sine of pi over 6 is the vertical value for this triangle. That's 1/2. So sine of pi over 6, I say 11 pi over 6, sine of 11 pi over 6 is negative 1/2. If you put this together, this knowledge of this triangle with the reference angle family and the quadrants in which the functions are positive, you should be able to find sine and cosine of any of those reference angle family values. So let's try sine of, let's do 2 pi over 3. We know 2 pi over 3 is the quadrant. Do you know it? It's the quadrant what? It's the quadrant 2 value for the reference angle family pi over 3. We know this is a quadrant 2 angle. Sine in quadrant 2 is positive. You don't need the plus sign. Just for emphasis, let's leave it there for now. And what is the sine of 2 pi of the reference angle is pi over 3? That corresponds to this triangle. Remember that we made it vertically oriented rather than horizontally. So now this is 1, this is root 3 over 2, this is 1/2. This is the triangle for the reference angle family pi over 6. Have that triangle in your mind's eye. This is the triangle for the reference angle pi over 3. Have that triangle in your mind's eye, and you don't need to memorize 50 different values. This triangle corresponds to this reference angle. Pi over sine is the vertical value. Sine is the y-coordinate. It's the vertical value. That's radical 3 over 2. We've taken care of the signum already. So sine of 2 pi over 3 is square root of 3 over 2. Let's try sine of, let's do 4 pi over 3. Same triangle, but what quadrant are we in? The reference angle family for pi over 3, that's why that's important to have in your mind. The reference angle family for pi over 3 is pi over 3 in quadrant 1. In quadrant 2, what is it? It's 2 pi over 3. In quadrant 3, what is it? It's 4 pi over 3. And in quadrant 4, 5 pi over 3. So this is the quadrant 3 member of the reference angle family for pi over 3. In quadrant 3, we know sine is negative. But once we have the signum accounted for, we know that the sine of 4 pi over 3 is the same as sine for all the reference angle families of pi over 3. Sine of pi over 3 is the vertical value, that's radical 3 over 2. So, except for the positive and negative, the sine value for pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3, and 5 pi over 3 are all going to be radical 3 over 2. Now, one option is to simply memorize all 4 of those, and memorize all 4 of cosine, and memorize all 4 of tangent, and memorize all of those 4 pi over. There's just so much memorizing to do. This, I think, is a more convenient way to have this picture in your mind's eye, this picture in your mind's eye, and then you know this already, and so that takes care of the signum. And then, remember that, the reference angle and the angle itself, these are equal except for the signum. And so once you take care of the positive or negative, then the value is going to be the same thing. Sine of 2 pi over 3 is positive root 3 over 2. Sine of 4 pi over 3 is negative root 3 over 2. It's the same number because it's the same reference angle family. But the signum is different because of the quadrant you're in. Can we do the last one there? Can we do sine of 5 pi over 3? Is it clear? That's the same reference angle family. So you can put in radical 3 over 2 before you even start. But now the question is, what is the signum? Well, this is the quadrant 4. Remember, the quadrants are, quadrant 1 is root 3 over pi over 3. Quadrant 2 is 2 pi over 3. Quadrant 3 is 4 pi over 3. And then quadrant 4 is 5 pi over 3. And so this is the quadrant 4 member of the reference angle family for pi over 3. In quadrant 4, sine must be negative, and so that's negative square root of 3 over 2. A similar approach works with pi over 4. So let's consider that scenario. Suppose we want sine of, let's do 5 pi over 4. Remember that pi over 4 reference angle family, those are the odd pi over 4 values. And so this is in quadrant 3. This is quadrant 3. Sine of quadrant 3 is negative, so we know it's negative something. And then this is where this new triangle comes into play. This value is 1. That lets us know that the hypotenuse is 1, so we know we're on the unit circle. And that's where this is 1 over radical 2 and 1 over radical 2. And sine is the vertical value. We know sine is the vertical. That's the y coordinate. That's the vertical value. So 1 over radical 2. Negative because of the quadrant. So consider each of those scenarios. Let's do one more and then we'll sign out for now. Let's do 3 pi over 4. Well, that's reference angle family is pi over 4. So we know we're using this triangle. We know sine is the vertical. That's the y coordinate. So that's 1. We know it's 1 over radical 2. And all we need to do now is account for the signum, or the positive negative. We know sine is positive in quadrant 2. And so we know this is positive. And so the sine of 3 pi over 4 is positive 1 over radical 2.